Hi, everybody. It's Chris. We're with the Cloverdale Transit Authority. That's my model railroad here at home. First, happy National Train Day to everybody, May 10th. Of course, this marks when the East and West railroads joined together and in 1868 to connect the two halves of the country via railroad. So, hope you're having a good day. I wanted to create this little slideshow video because a number of people were asking me after I was posting photos of a model train that I recently purchased, and they said, "Gosh, that really looks so futuristic? Was that a real train, or is that just kind of a fantasy train? If that's something that was made up?" But indeed, it is a real train. The Commodore Vanderbilt J1E Hudson. It had a cab number of 5344, and it was outfitted in the streamlined style in 1934. So it had been a J series Hudson, and in the 1930s, the Art Deco design movement was in play, and cars were being streamlined, and kitchen appliances and lamps and furniture and everything. So the railroad, specifically the New York Central Railroad, said, "Hey, it would be kind of cool for us to add that sort of design aesthetic to our passenger service locomotives." And so this very first streamlined Hudson came along. And of course, a lot of people said it kind of looked like an inverted bathtub, which it does. Anyway, so they built this out, and they named it the Commodore Vanderbilt after this fellow, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had been a naval guy back in his day, but also became a railroad tycoon and helped found the New York Central Railroad. And so when this was first rolled out, they named it in his honor. But here's a photo of the Vanderbilt after it had been outfitted with its body panels. But below is a picture as they were starting to outfit it. And you can see they started putting this tubular framing around it so they could put these body panels. And normally, obviously, a locomotive is essentially a boiler on wheels. They're very strange looking. We're used to them because it's part of our culture, and we think they're beautiful. We look at them and we say, "Oh, look, isn't that great? Look at that machine." But really, they were kind of this thing with stuff hanging off of it and pipes running everywhere. So that was the idea, was to be able to take that, and a fellow who worked for New York Central by the name of Carl Catola, he designed this for the New York Central, and and so they wanted it to kind of have that modern aesthetic, and so they took that train below and they made the design of the train or the locomotive above. Now, the one thing I've always said when I look at these, and there are other streamlined locomotives that came along later, we'll talk about that in a minute, but I always looked at that and I thought, how difficult must that have been to handle as far as maintenance? Because with the usual locomotive that we see, like you see below there, it'd pull in and you had access to everything, compressors and the smoke box and the steam chest and the sand dome and the steam dome and all, all those parts that make up a steam locomotive. But then you put all these body panels on, and I can only imagine that when this pulled into the maintenance shop, every guy that had to work on this looked and went, "Oh man, not this thing again," because they had to take all of those body panels off, or at least parts of them where they needed to get to, in order to do the maintenance first, rather than just walk up and start working on it. So anyway, the Vanderbilt served in this configuration after it had been outfitted in 1934 till about 1938, and in 1938 they were experimenting with more and more versions of these streamlined locomotives, and this fellow came along, and his name is Henry Dreyfuss. And if you're a train buff at all, you probably are very familiar with the Dreyfuss Hudson. And the Dreyfuss Hudson was a new style of locomotive that was streamlined, but it Henry had the idea of making it more compact, making it lighter, making it easier to get to all of the parts that might need to be repaired. And so this came along in 1938. As a matter of fact, the Commodore Vanderbilt was reconfigured to the Dreyfuss Hudson style only 4 years or 4 or 5 years, 4 years after it had been rolled out as the inverted bathtub. But this is probably one of, when we now start talking about model railroading, this is probably one of the most sought after style of steam locomotive in the model railroading world. As a matter of fact, Lionel had produced this style, this Dreyfuss style of toy locomotive, going back into pretty much when this rolled out, into the late 1930s. So you see that, and people always say, "What's the bullet-shaped train? That's the one I want for Christmas." And so it's pretty highly sought after. As a matter of fact, in the catalog this year, 2023, they have rolled out yet again another version of the Dreyfuss Hudson in the scale version. And we're going to talk a little bit about gauge versus O scale, and the fact that there is a difference between those. And I get that question from friends a lot. It's like, well, I've got Lionel trains. I don't understand why some people say O scale, O gauge. Is it the same thing? No, it's not the same thing. We're going to talk about that real briefly, hopefully briefly, in a minute. But anyway, so Lionel rolled out a Dreyfuss Hudson in their catalog again this year, and this is one of the scale versions, and it's got all the prototypical sounds and steam and all this other stuff. And these are pretty expensive trains. Model railroading is got a very large price disparity from what it used to have back when people were just buying these as toys. Anyway, let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about my Dreyfuss Hudson, my Commodore Vanderbilt Hudson. We'll get back to the Dreyfuss in a minute. Anyway, this is the train made by a company called MTH, or Mike's Train House. And you may not have heard of that because Lionel, of course, is this international brand. People sort of generically refer to a toy train as a Lionel train, or the O gauge trains as Lionel trains. And there are a number of other companies, and even back in the day, American Flyer and so forth were making these O gauge trains. But really the big ones today are MTH and Lionel. So this is one made by MTH, and this is the train that I got, along with 5 passenger cars from a fellow who was selling it on Facebook Marketplace. It lives near me, and I purchased it, and we did a little maintenance on it, and then my friend and his wife, we became friends. And this is the great thing about hobbies in general, and especially model railroading, is you have this commonality with people that you oftentimes have never met because you have this passion for this particular subject. So anyway, MTH was founded by, again, Mike's Train House, by a guy named Mike Wolf, and this is not Mike Wolf from American Pickers. This is actually a younger picture of Mike Wolf. He actually just retired from the business, but MTH is still going. Mike started off as somebody who was making reproduction parts for rebuilding, repairing pre-war and post-war Lionel trains, and he had a partnership with Lionel, and then he started producing his own stuff, and he and Lionel sort of parted ways, and there's more to that story, but you can Google that if you're really that interested. Anyway, so Mike built a really great business on these high-end trains that had all these circuit boards in them, and had sounds, and did all these different things, and so it was really kind of a competitive alternative to Lionel, which was moving in that direction, as well as having these more high-end collectible trains. As a matter of fact, Lionel did make their own version in the late 1980s. My version of the Commodore Vanderbilt from MTH came out in 1998. This came out in 1999, end of 98, 99, and this was Lionel's version. And you can see it's pretty much the same train or locomotive, but the difference is it's a lighter color, whereas this is a battleship gray. The MTH version that I have was kind of a gunmetal gray, and And in truth, all of the photos that we have of the original Vanderbilt were all in black and white. So all we could tell that it was gray. Couldn't really tell necessarily what tone it was, depending upon the exposure and the contrast of the photograph. But this was the version that Lionel came out with. Now, let's go and talk a little bit about O gauge versus O scale. And this is where we trying not to get into the weeds on this, but I get so many questions like this. Here are Lionel's O scale Commodore Vanderbilt and O scale Dreyfuss Hudson. The difference between they both O gauge and O scale run on the same track, the familiar 3-rail track. But the scale engines are to appropriate scale as they would be to the width of the track. So that's what it would really look like sitting on the track. The O gauge stuff, what I'm going to call semi-scale, like my Commodore Vanderbilt, like those old Lionel trains that you run around the tree, they are smaller. They're a semi-scale. And the reason that the train manufacturers did this is because, they could make them less expensive. They weren't like these high-end, full-size scale locomotives. And the cars were smaller, and they took up less room, and it wasn't as expensive. But once we got into the late 1990s, they really sort of moved away from all of that. And everything became scale. And I will admit, everything became expensive. Again, Lionel has starter sets for $350, $400, which includes an oval of track and the power supply and the locomotive and the cars and everything. And they're pretty scale, but they're starter sets. They're not high-end. They make a few sounds, and they do a few prototypical things to the actual model railroad, but they're not these high-end pieces. That Dreyfuss Hudson, which you see in the new 2023 Lionel catalog, that with the passenger car set is around $2,000, a little more than $2,000. So that is one of the complaints, is people say the price point of this is really making it difficult for people to get into model railroading. And I always tell people no, because you can go to a train show, you can go on eBay, and you can find all kinds of model railroad stuff going back into the 1930s that's very, very easy to acquire and just as much fun. But the high-end model railroad guys, this is the stuff they're going for. So let me show you a picture that's going to make this make a lot more sense. Here's two box cars, same type of box car, pretty much the same type of markings. The one in the front is the semi-scale box car. This is what you see in all the Lionel sets going up into the late 1990s, and probably what you have under the tree, from going back from your dad's train from the 1950s. The one in the back is a scale locomotive, a scale box car. It's a scale box car that attaches to a locomotive, but that is the actual scale. If you're doing scale modeling, for you guys that are modelers, that's a scale that matches the width of the outer rails of the track. That's what it would really look like. So all of that other stuff, N gauge and HO, that stuff's always been scale. But the bigger, O gauge stuff, the Lionel size trains, they were always sort of semi-scale because, it just was less expensive to produce that. But as time went along, there were people that really wanted to start doing scale model railroading. And that's been going on for some time, but it's really where it's at now. If you're buying any semi-scale stuff at this point, it's usually, with a few exceptions, it's usually stuff that, was made from the early 2000s and back. Most everything made today is strictly on the O scale stuff, so the larger stuff. But that gives you an example. Here's another example. So here's my runners for the Cloverdale Transit Authority. And you can see that the locomotives in the Commodore Vanderbilt, those are all O gauge semi-scale trains. On the left side is my 1948 Hudson. In the middle is the K Series Prairie Pacific Hudson from 1950. And the one in the middle is the one that I played with when I was a kid, and that was my dad's model 2037 Hudson from 1953. And then, of course, there's the Vanderbilt. So those are all that's how they would all look if they were in real life sitting next to each other. But they're not full scale, they're semi-scale. Remember the pictures of the boxcars. Now, in real life, the Vanderbilt was like 18 feet high, okay? On the very end, there's our trolley. Now that trolley is scale. So that trolley is scale to the tracks. It's a real scale miniature. However, it's much bigger compared to the Vanderbilt. It would be much smaller. It would only be half the height of the real Vanderbilt. So you can see, again, like the boxcar picture, you can see the difference between the stuff that was these semi-scale electric trains and then the scale stuff that everybody's into now. So anyway, hopefully that made a lot of sense to you, because it is a very difficult thing to think about and try to comprehend. But I think these pictures sort of illustrate it for you. So anyway, that's a little video slideshow about, yes, there was a real Commodore Vanderbilt train back in the 1930s. And there is, of course, today existing a really cool version of that train in model form, running model form. And I'm really excited about having this train. It's like a beautiful piece of artwork. So if you have any questions about this video, please put them in the comments below. If you have any other questions about railroads and model railroading and stuff like that, I don't have all the answers, but I've got a lot of friends who have answers, and I know they'd love to chime in on this stuff and answer your questions. My big thing is, if you've got a model train and it's sitting in your attic or sitting in your basement, get it out, clean it up, put it under the tree, put it on top of a ping pong table, and enjoy it, and let your family enjoy it, because model railroading and model railroad cars and locomotives are also family heirlooms. So make sure that you keep that going through your family. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with some running footage of the MTH Commodore Vanderbilt with some track laid on the living room floor, and let you see and hear what it sounds like. Didn't put a lot of smoke drops into the stack because I didn't want to stink up the living room. So enjoy that, and I'll catch you on the next video.
Timeless, Vanderbilt, sleek and fast, streamlined for the future and fueled by the past. They were tall as iron giants, cloaked in their steel shrouds, like chariots from the future, arriving on misty clouds. New York Central, rail and machine, fire, smoke and steam. New York Central, ghosts of the rails. From New York to Chicago, traveling along the rails, you can smell the history in the air with each breath that you inhale. Like a noble knight of olden days with his armor and his shield, and 400,000 pounds of iron, chrome, and steel. New York Central, rail and machine, fire, smoke and steam. New York Central, ghosts of the rails. With miles of cars behind them, faster than ever before, the 20th Century Limited in the majestic Commodore. I remember the mighty Mercury like it was yesterday, the train of tomorrow, dressed in gleaming gray.